I'm Lee Milan. In this video, we're going to look at sound shaping with multiband compression. So there's a few different dynamic processes within Ableton Live, and multiband is one in particular. So if we drag this onto our drum track here, you'll see it looks quite different than, let's say, compressor. The key difference is compressor is what we call a broadband compressor. So when it changes the volume of a signal, it changes it for all frequencies. Multiband is exactly the opposite. It will change the volume of certain frequencies per band. So there's one band within the compressor, which is a broadband, and in a multiband compressor, there are multiple bands. So let's have a look at how that works. If I play my drum track with the multiband turned off, we've got a drum sound, but it needs a bit of shaping. It's not quite got the impact and presence that we want for our drums. If I turn on the multiband, you'll see at the moment this is 3 bands, so it's a triple multiband compressor. And we can see this volume for each of the 3 different bands. Now, to know what these bands are and what they actually represent in terms of where these frequencies have been split into 3, we can solo each band. Okay, so that's the 3 different bands, but if we solo out any of these bands, we can also choose where what we call the crossover is between each band. So remember, 3 bands, and the point where one band crosses into the next is called the crossover, and these are variable. So what will actually happen is the size of the high band will change and the size of the middle band will be reduced if we move that crossover lower down into the frequency band. And the same principles apply for that lower frequency. So I'm going to solo out the mid band and change that high frequency crossover. Or we could do the opposite. We could listen to the high band and choose where our crossover needs to be for that high frequency. So right up there, we're just getting the noise that comes from the snare and not much else in the drum track. So if we wanted to isolate that part of the signal and treat that differently, maybe squeeze it so the level differences from one sound to the next are a bit closer together, less dynamic, we can do that. Let's go for the solo of the low band. So at that setting, we can hear the low energy of the kick and the snare drum. But if we wanted to just focus on the low energy of the kick, we could roll it down until the crossover is low enough that it's below the low frequency of the snare. And you can see by the volume differences of that meter that the kick and the rhythm is much greater than the volume of the snare at that point too. So to a more or less degree, we're isolating out those frequencies relevant to the kick drum. Now this is on the drum mix, this is on my drum bus. So we can actually drag this and put it down onto a single sound, which let's say my kick, and we can listen to that on its own. Okay, so if we want to go for a broadband compression with this unit, we can turn off 2 of the bands and we're left with a broadband compressor where it's just going to change the properties of this as a whole, all frequencies at once. And that allows me to explain the compression aspect of this. So compression is when a signal exceeds a certain volume, we can choose if we're going to attenuate the volume above that point. And how fast we attenuate that volume is what we call the attack stage. When that signal exceeded the threshold, how long will that compressor take to react? Then, after that moment has passed and the signal has dropped back down towards below the threshold, how long does it take for that compressor to actually respond again? How long does the release stage last? How long does it take to listen again and start reacting to that signal? So we have attack and release here. So let's have a look at this sound when we're in broadband mode for a minute. And I've moved my threshold to underneath the maximum volume of that kick. Now, I can do it with the symbol here and just choose the settings. If I choose the higher threshold and ratios here, we can use this to dictate with numbers the threshold position and then that ratio of what's going on. For every decibel that goes in, how many decibels will be reduced, how much attenuation will happen. So the lower down I go, the more attenuation will happen to the signal. So I'm going to go very extreme, which is the limiter basically. For every 1 decibel that goes in, nothing passes above that. Okay, so I'm going back to the actual time aspect, which is attack and release. And let's play with that attack stage and let the signal slip through that attack stage. Okay, so let's move over to pulling this back up here for a minute. Let's try this on a different sound and let's try multiband. Let's put it on the snare for a minute and listen to that. Just set these back to their defaults, hitting the backspace key. And let's find some part of the snare which we might want to change to be slightly different in its nature over time in terms of how much attenuation we give to it. So I'm trying to move that multiband crossover, so I'm only hearing the noise part of the snare and none of the snap in the mid-range and the low frequencies, and none of the fundamental, which is that low thump that goes underneath it. So the first way we can use when we're doing sound shaping and we want to change the properties of different bands is we can use a multiband as a simple EQ. Now, an EQ is an option when we want to rebalance the frequencies, but it does it in a different way to a multiband. A multiband, if you remember, had those 3 bands, and it's a very steep transition between this one and this one. That crossover is very immediate, and then the crossover between there is very immediate too. So if we start to rebalance these bands, the steepness of the frequencies being one volume and then dropping to the next band or increasing to the next band is quite severe. So it gives quite a tonal character to this. So I'm just going to increase the volume of that high band and try and get some more of the noise out of that snare. Okay, let's listen to the mid band. So that's our mid-range kind of snap, which means our sub, or sorry, not our sub, our low band should allow some of that low energy to be isolated. Okay, so I've gone for the same treatment as I did with the kick before. I've applied a lower threshold and I've set it so the ratio is going to reduce or attenuate the signal as it comes through. Now, I'm going to change the mode here. We're in RMS mode, which means it's an average mode and it's not responding very quickly to very loud momentary peaks or transients. So I set it to peak mode. This will now react a little bit faster. And we can see the amount of gain reduction happening here on the left. It says around about -11 decibels of gain reduction is currently happening to the signal. So I'm going to offset by turning this up by around about 11 as well. So without and with. So again, I've added more or a steeper ratio, a harder ratio. So now -17, so let's increase that to bring back that level. And let's go to the attack stage and allow the beginning of that low frequency to come through just before it's massively reduced by the compression. Okay, so listen without. So remember, the top band was literally just increased, no actual dynamic change to it. We just increased the volume of the high band, but the low band we did reshape, setting the attack so it let the signal through a little bit before it got actually attenuated and pulled down in volume. So the last thing I wanted to show you in terms of how these bands can behave and how it can be useful when you're first getting into multi-band processing is to use it to duck certain frequencies. So I've got my drum track here, which has obviously got kicks and snares and so on as well. And I've got a bass part, which is over this way. So I'm going to grab a multiband and put that at the end of my bass. So my drums sound like this. And my bass sounds like this. So let's listen to the low band of the bass. Listen to that kick again. So potentially some conflicts because that bass is continuously running through every beat of my idea here, but the kick is occasionally playing as an accenting for the rhythm section. So what I'm going to try and use is the multiband to reduce the volume of the low competing frequencies from the bass while the kick plays, and then when the kick stop playing, allows the bass to swell back up and get back to its original volume, but its original volume for just that frequency band, not the whole bass sound. So we won't find that the mid and the tops of the bass would start reducing. It'll just be that low energy that's ducked out of the way. So in order to do that, what we need to do is, rather than the multiband processor listening to itself to know when to compress and what level to adjust itself to, we do the external sidechain option. So I'm going to open up sidechaining here. I'm going to tell it to listen to the drum track. And then from the second chooser menu, I'm going to find within all the sounds within my drum rack, I'm going to find the kick sound. Now, what you can find is if you listen to the sidechain, you can listen to what it's doing, the sidechain signal. But also when you turn on the listen to sidechain, you see the actual volume increase and decrease of the sidechain signal as this little line on the band. But when it's not there, when it's not enabled, sorry, you don't see it on the actual device. So that's quite useful for knowing where to set your threshold settings to get this compression behavior. So the kick's coming up to here, so let's pull the threshold down for that band. Let's pull down the ratio again. Now you can see that here there's a rest when that kick plays. So let's just solo out the kick for a minute so we can hear that alongside. So without. So the low end energy is being reduced, but the mid-range, that kind of muted, discordant mid-range of that bass, that's still playing at full volume because that doesn't conflict with the kick sound at all. So the sidechain input controls all the bands. So if we want it to do things to different frequencies from the same sound or different sounds, we have to add different multiband devices to do that. But for now, that's our sidechain signal being introduced to something that's processing another sound, and we're allowing the external sidechain signal to duck the band down while we're processing something else. So that's sound shaping with multiband compression, how the different bands work, how we set them to be the frequency bands and areas we want to work on for what we're treating, and then how we can use the threshold, ratio, attack and release when we're compressing on a band, and finally how we can use an external sidechain source to tell a band on another sound when to be compressed.